Okay, this is Tim again. John, would you like to kick off this call? I think we've got a good group on the line and we should begin.
Thanks so much, Tim. Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome everybody who's joining us for the Refugee Investment Network's first official webinar on refugee lens investing. So this is been a little bit of a long time coming for us. Over the last year, we've been preparing some curriculum to help onboard folks into the refugee and migration landscape in the context of investing. And we're thrilled that so many of you have joined, some of our steering committee members, some of our partners, but many new friends from the investment space. We have folks from microfinance, folks who work in SME support and investing. We have several continents represented here. And it's very clear that there are both practitioners of what we call refugee lens investing, as well as folks who are new to the field. So this webinar is really meant to serve as a sort of an introductory 101 primer for people looking at participating in refugee lens investing. We will be doing subsequent webinars in the future. And we'll also look to guidance and feedback from you that will shape what we cover in future webinars and what's most relevant and actionable. So thank you all for joining. Just a couple of housekeeping issues. One, questions. We'd love to hear from you and we'd love to make this as useful as possible. So throughout the course of the presentation, Tim and I will be trading off on different slides. But if you have questions, just drop them into the chat box and we will address them towards the end of the discussion. Tim, anything else you want to add before we get started?
No, I think that's a great intro, John. And I think before we start flipping through the slides, a little bit of level setting would be helpful for the crowd. As John mentioned, this is a 101. So we'll be covering sort of from A to Z at a high level. But we will dig down and really get into what most substantively we've found demand for and interest in the RIN since we got going, since we started. And let me begin there just by saying that, you know, the RIN has only been around for about a year and a half. John and I were brought together by Andrew Stern, who's the CEO of the Global Development Incubator. I think he saw us as sort of two peas in a pod, but of people that could sort of complement one another's skill sets. And so when we came together, we felt strongly about this global issue of displacement, and we wanted to do something about it. And GDI, being the organization that creates these large-scale social enterprises that try to address some of the world's global challenges, the world's biggest challenges, really came behind RIN. And so we got together the summer of 2018 and got to work on our founding document, which some of you have looked at, I know, which is called A Paradigm Shift: How Investment Can Unlock the Potential of Refugees. This can be found on our website and is really our landscape document that we brought forth at the SOCAP conference in San Francisco in 2018. Following that conference, we really tried to sort of begin to build out our framework of the RIN. And again, some of you might have heard more about our work through our launch at the Rockefeller Center on World Refugee Day earlier this year. That would have been June of earlier this year. And then this most past week, this most recent event was SOCAP 19. These are some of the touchstones in the evolution of the Refugee Investment Network that are sort of landmarks in our work. Just to bring you up to date on sort of our current projects, which you'll be hearing more about through this presentation, we have a really robust research agenda that is focused on Mexico and the private sector investment context for refugee investments in Mexico, underway currently. That has top priority in addition to our Refugee Opportunity Index, which we'll be talking about a little bit later, which is an index we're developing to incentivize governments to create pro-refugee policies. So those two research and sort of think and do activities are underway currently right now, along with everything else you can see on our webpage. So that's just a quick level set on the RIN. John, do you want to mention what the objectives are quickly for this webinar, just high level?
Sure. I think the first thing is really to engage, update, and to strengthen the community of practitioners working on refugee migration lens investing. This is not a field that is going to grow itself. It's not something that will advance by the creation of a single fund or the investment into a single company or entity. We need to grow the field, expand the diversity of capital that is participating, expand the diversity of the deals that are being done and structured, and use all of this to advance and shift the narrative around how displaced people are perceived or welcomed into communities. So it's really, one of the things that we've learned, which we'll talk about later in gender lens investing, is the importance of education and using education as a way to empower practice. I think the next goal for this is to just continue to build this field with a discussion on the why, what, and how of investing in refugees. And to understand that as a community, we're very much demand driven. So we are seeking feedback and the identification of priorities going forward. And this is our first engagement in this through webinar program. So thanks again for everyone for joining and for listening and participating. Tim, I'll let you kick it off and get us into the presentation.
Very good. Next slide, please. Well, when we speak with investors, a lot of whom are very cognizant of the displacement crisis that's underway, but we often put this slide forward to put some things in perspective, just the magnitude of the current displacement crisis. These numbers here that you see, the 74 million people that have been forcibly displaced in the world back in 2018 has already grown up to over 80 million, as many of you are aware, this year, and is on its way. And I think this is probably a conservative number that we've chosen to use, but a daunting one, just the same, of 300 million by the year 2030. These are UNHCR numbers. And if you can go to the next slide, I'll break down how we look at this issue definitionally. Again, as an investor sort of facing organization, when we created our landscape document, Paradigm Shift, we conducted over 200 interviews, and we got a lot of questions came to us, just simple ones, or seemingly simple, which are quite complicated actually. What is a refugee? And so we thought we could add value by defining refugee a bit differently than probably many of you have heard defined before, but here's our definition, our working definition. It's a broad one, and it's inclusive of forcibly displaced people, those who have been pushed across international borders for various reasons, traditionally are those called by the UN as refugees. However, we also add in internally displaced people who are climate change refugees, and the communities they live in. And on this last point, I just want to revisit it. This was something that, a definition that we vetted with many of you on the phone, our ecosystem, our network, and I think we all came together around. We also, I think, learned from the creation of the gender investment lens, where some of the originators of that lens spoke to us and said, don't make the mistake of defining too tightly your definitions, both of your lens and some of your definitions, because it's easier to narrow than it is to broaden going forward. And so I think when you look at our work, you'll see it a little bit broad, but fully cognizant that we have to keep a heads up for any washing of our focus groups going forward. Can we go to the next slide, please? refugees and the SDGs, we've often been asked, where do you fall under in the sustainable development goals? Where do you connect most closely? And as we looked at the 17 SDGs, we really found that 13 of the 17 have components which touch this very horizontal issue. The word refugees and displacement is only called out in a couple of instances in this broad framework of the Sustainable Development Goals. However, as this slide points out, really establishes this as a horizontal issue that impacts clearly each one of these. Can we go to the next slide, please? Over the course of our work, we very much looked for gaps and barriers and issues that really are challenging to people that are on the move. And again, generally, broadly, we've sort of grouped them into these three areas here that really sort of tie people up, lock them up. And we broke them into three buckets here: political, economic, and regulatory. Many of you are familiar with these. These are the challenges that will position ourselves in trying to, when we lay out sort of our efforts going forward, to sort of address these and facilitate some of these and unburden many of these processes that are keeping people who have been displaced in limbo and not allowing them to engage in their economies or to have a fair shake. Next slide, please. I think in these next couple of slides here, John will talk us through some of our findings from our report and that have been repeated throughout our work with our stakeholders.
Thanks so much, Tim. I think that this is something that we have different names for it, but this is not it's not just about the humanitarian appeal and sort of the need and the urgency of supporting what have traditionally been thought of and in many cases are vulnerable communities, but it is also about uplifting and supporting incredibly self-reliant, resilient people and communities who are just too often kept out of the formal system or formal economies. In essence, we see that there is a very real and tangible business case for the practice of refugee and migration lens investing. You could call it, the immigrant alpha, but there's a body of evidence and data that I think reinforces this. From a credit perspective, 4 years ago, if you asked a microfinance institution to consider lending to refugee entrepreneurs in their backyard, most of the considerations would have led to a no, with the perception that refugee entrepreneurs at the micro level were too risky, that there might be a flight risk. People are here temporarily, they're going home. Why should we invest in their business? But of course, we know that that's not the case, that refugee micro entrepreneurs are at a very baseline on par with traditional lending customers. Just a note from Maria that there are people trying to get in to the session. Okay, great. We'll have our team make sure that they're able to enter. You bet. Thanks for letting us know, Maria. Someone had to take a chance, though, to actually prove this out. You cannot change a system if someone isn't willing to go first. And we'll talk about them later, but Kiva, through the mobilization of philanthropic and catalytic capital, was able to test things out with local MFI partners to give them access to capital that was more or less unrestricted, and to say, here's not just 0% interest capital, but just see what happens. And the data that came back was very favorable, and has shown now that these are very much viable customers, and that MFIs that aren't seeing them as such are really just missing out. So let's go to the next slide. from an employability perspective. And all of this will all sort of come together in the refugee lens. But you know, if you think about companies that are offering gainful employment to displaced people, data has shown, particularly thanks to research from a number of entities, including funding from the Tent Partnership for Refugees, that in 17 different industries, companies that have significant commitments to hiring refugees, as well as from Amplia Recruiting, which has now placed over 4,000 refugees resettled into the US, into jobs in hospitality, manufacturing, and advanced manufacturing. There are higher retention rates. With higher retention rates come better cash flows for companies. Better cash flows mean reinvestment into operations, products, and of course, paying out dividends for investors. So you can start to connect the dots on the value here. Next slide. Refugees are extraordinary entrepreneurial. So in the United States, there are over 180,000 refugee-led businesses. This is not by coincidence. When you are forced on the margins of society, whether through explicit or implicit biases and policies, your options in terms of what you can do from a career perspective are reduced. But if you have been through quite an enduring experience as someone who's traveled a great deal, forced out of their home and forced to move, you are incredibly resilient. It's just part of the nature of your experience. And so we find that in every country we look at, there are higher rates of entrepreneurship as a percentage of population than any other group within the refugee community. So, and this, we're really speaking specifically about formally recognized refugees, although this does translate into other forcibly displaced groups, asylum seekers, internally displaced people as well. But you know, think about the US immigrant community and the fact that Fortune 500 company, 44% of them were founded or started by immigrants or displaced people or their children. That isn't by coincidence. And this is important because we have to recognize this and then start to think about how to best serve and support these communities. Next slide, please. I'm not sure what these little graphics are popping up, but when we began, part of our understanding was that there was practice that people had been investing in some companies that were connected to displaced people, but it was often by accident. We are not, it's not that there was a lack of refugee companies or some lack of pipeline, which is, you know, a common excuse from the capital community, particularly from traditional holders of capital, which have often been people that look like myself, you know, white males. There was a lack of intentionality, and I think that's really important in the context of this work. How do we become intentional about using the resources that we have, whether as investors or as funders, as partners doing this work, to intentionally support and enable either displaced people or individuals supporting displaced people to make that happen. We worked with about 35 different stakeholders from the investment community, from displaced backgrounds, both within the United States and in developing markets, those from the advocacy community, the humanitarian response community, to craft something that would be a sort of a first version of a lens that investors can use to source, qualify, and identify deals that truly would be supporting the livelihoods and well-being of displaced people and the ones that are hosting them. This was also inspired by the Gender 2X initiative at OPIC and much of the thought process that went into that. Again, as Tim said earlier, it was something that we wanted to have as broad, but still be very meaningful. So in this context, we have R1 to R6, so 6 different categories of deals. That really means deals that are majority led or majority managed by displaced people. Again, when we say refugee in this context, it is with the RIN sort of definition that includes anyone who's been forcibly displaced. This is particularly relevant in countries in the global south as opposed to those here in the global north. What we are not talking about are companies that might be led by someone who is a former refugee in a non-OECD country, like an Uber, that has not demonstrated any meaningful commitment to support forcibly displaced communities. So Uber, their CEO today, was a former refugee, but Uber hasn't yet demonstrated a meaningful commitment to support forcibly displaced people. So that is not something we would consider to be a refugee investment. If tomorrow they changed their strategy and said, we're going to hire 20% of our workforce from these communities, we're going to make sure that we're providing equal pay and compensation, that might be different. Now, we have refugee supporting businesses as well. Those businesses could be companies that are operating through an employment lens, so they're making major hiring commitments. And I just say major because it needs to be proportionate to the total number of employees of that company. Just because a company hires one person, that's not a significant commitment for us. And it has to be relevant to the overall size of that enterprise. It could also be companies that are providing products or services that are improving the outcomes for these communities, whether that's in health, education, energy, access, housing is a really important one, financial services, as well as companies improving humanitarian response capacity. So Tim talked about the broad definition. We also think about the total journey of someone, from the root causes and really thinking about prevention of displacement, because that journey puts a lot of people at great risk. 2, we think about humanitarian investing and improving outcomes and capacity of the humanitarian response community. And then 3 is really about economic integration and more long-term investment opportunities. And then in here we have lending facilities and funds that are supporting all of the above. And I think it's also important just to reiterate that host communities have to be considered in any investment strategy to support displaced people. What we have seen when resources are solely given to displaced people is an escalation in tensions. And really what we want to do is invert that and think about investment as a way to bring a bridge together and advance social cohesion for different communities. Okay, next slide, please.
Thanks, John. That was a great overview. And what we're going to do now is we're going to get into some of the examples that you'll find on our website, and we'll be directing you there specifically as we go through this deck. But these are some of the enterprises you'll find on our website. They're companies that we've had a dialogue with for some time and have been working with quite actively, especially last summer, as we built our site and built this probably 36 or so investment enterprise sorts of investments that we list on our site and have been working with. And what we'll do now is we'll go through each one of the 6 types of refugee investments which we've described. If we can go to the next slide, we'll start off with an R1 investment. And as John noted, R1 investments are majority refugee-owned companies and/or refugee listed as key person organizations in their operating documents. And this organization is really an interesting one. It was founded by Teo Ruja in 2016 and is very much focused on identities. And Tay was a displaced person who found himself in the Netherlands without an identity. And I won't read this to you or the longer version of this on the website, but it's really quite compelling and a good example of a refugee-owned business that is really focused on one of the critical aspects that probably many of us are familiar with, which is identity, and how that is lost often when one is forced to leave their home country. This initiative, this enterprise, helps to get around that, and is one that we support very much from an impact standpoint. Can we move to an R2 investment, John, and perhaps you can introduce the next slide?
Thanks so much, Tim. This is Ola Code is a company that was started by a woman who was based in London initially and then returned back to Mexico. Her co-founder is actually someone that was forcibly displaced from the United States as an undocumented resident, Lenny Alvarez and Marcela Torres. There is a major market gap in Mexico in the tech sector. There are several 100,000 tech sector jobs that currently don't exist. So you have companies that are based in Mexico, as well as companies that are providing products and services in Mexico that have a major labor and talent shortage. So they're outsourcing. At the same time, you have a multifaceted displacement context in Mexico. You have several 100,000 people who have been forcibly displaced from Central America, some due to violent crime, some due to climate issues. You have people coming from Venezuela, you have people coming from Cuba and Haiti, and then you have a huge number of people who are actually now being sent back to Mexico from the United States, many of whom are Mexican citizens, but like Lenny, grew up in the United States. And the experience that they are having as individuals is very similar to an experience of a refugee. If you grew up in the United States from year 2 or 3 or 4, your primary language is likely to be English. Your relationships, your assets, your resources, your history is here. Your family is here in the United States. And when you are forcibly displaced, either through deportation or self-deportation, you're returning to a place that is, for all purposes, really foreign. And for certain things like employment or for housing, which is also required for actually having full employment, in Mexico, you need a guarantor. That social connections don't exist. And so a lot of people end up in shelters. And this is something that has been exacerbated over the last couple of years, as many of us all know. Ola Code is really working to address 2 things. One is a very real market need in the talent sector, or the talent area in the tech sector. And 2, providing real opportunities for truly transformative employment and training for forcibly displaced people in Mexico, most of whom are young, from 17 to 30 years of age, sometimes even younger. The primary community that Ola Code is serving, their customers and clients, are repatriated Mexican citizens who are often bilingual, but not always, who are tech enabled, meaning that they've grown up with access to a smartphone and a computer, but don't have any formal training in coding. Ola Code puts them through a 5-month training program. They provide a loan through a local lender called Kubo, which is also supported by Kiva's lending. Kubo provides an 8% loan, which is sort of an education scholarship loan, which the clients of Ola Code pay back once they've been formally employed. Now, the amazing thing is that they're bringing people in with no income whatsoever, no training whatsoever, and they're placing them in jobs or securing contracts for them and increasing their income to 33,000 pesos per month on average, which is around $2,000, $2,500, depending on the currency at the time. That puts them in the 1% in Mexico. Really impressive. And we hope to see a lot more from Ola Code. Let's go to the R3. Needs list. Some of you may know needs list. Needs list is basically a wedding registry for unmet needs of communities who've been displaced or are at risk. This includes both formal refugee communities, but also those who are displaced or are vulnerable because of disasters or major climate events. Needs List is a tech company, a tech platform. They closed $1 million round at the end of June, just a few months ago, with participation from Amplio Ventures, which is a new investment fund for early stage enterprises, Marigold Capital, Omidyar, Next Waves, SV2, and Kuo Sharper Fund. And I think, they're a very good example of a company that is supporting refugees with their products and services. It's also improving humanitarian response capacity. So it's just another sort of lens to think about, where they're a company based here in the US or the global north, but they're really offering global support services. All right, next slide, please. Tim, I'll turn this over to you.
And let me unmute myself. Thank you. Our fours are refugee supporting host-weighted investments. And these are investments that are very much supporting of refugees, but often run out of the host communities, and as this moniker suggests. And Cafe Bienvenue is an organization that we've mostly read about. We haven't interacted with Cafe Bienvenue, but we have interacted with Singa. And Singa, if you don't know, is just really been doing great work based out of France, and now actually starting up an office in San Francisco in the near term. I think they have a total of 8 or 9 offices now, but they're an incubator. And this is one of their incubees, Cafe Bienvenue, which is just trying to do a great job at hiring and really working on the integration of displaced people within the French community, and we thought was just a really good example of the sort of R4 investment that's making a difference. Next slide, please.
So I mentioned Kiva earlier. Especially those of you who worked in the microfinance space are very familiar with Kiva, but what you may not know is Kiva is really taking a leap forward with their work. Initially as kiva.org was structured to provide lending, micro lending through their crowd platform with a 0% interest rate, they have found that there's an opportunity for them to actually offer a wholesale product to investors. And that has launched the creation of Kiva Capital. And the first investment fund of Kiva Capital will be a lending facility under what's called the Kiva Refugee Investment Fund. They have plans to expand this to $100 million eventually, but this will initially start with a $30 million placement. It will be multi-region, so they will be looking at the Middle East, they'll be looking at Latin America, and some other locations. They expect to be providing between higher single-digit offerings, but still at somewhat concessionary rates for investors. So this is, I think, appealing because one, it's tapping into a new pool of capital for Kiva and for the community of displaced entrepreneurs. Two, it is offering a real return. It might not be above market, but it is offering a return nonetheless. This is, I think, 6 to 7% is what they're looking at, and that is because they've been able to blend the market rates from different regions. So in the Middle East, capital is much cheaper. In Latin America, it's much more expensive, and so that's kind of where they've been able to price this and offer something that might be attractive to folks that are looking for a bigger impact, but still achieve something that could be near market, depending on the instrument. This is really building off of the data that they have accumulated through their philanthropic or 0% interest loans. And I think it's something to consider when we think about mobilizing capital across the continuum, because different kinds of capital have different roles and opportunities. The important thing is that everyone see that they have a role and an opportunity to really move the needle and to support displaced people. For philanthropy, it's really about helping to pave the way for new investments, new kinds of products, to do things that might mean taking more of an upfront risk, and to proving out new models. This couldn't have happened without that work, and key partners like USA for the UNHCR, which really helped to spearhead and lead that sort of data building work. And then investors can come and participate, and that's where we can grow the community of capital in play here. So let's go on to an R6.
R6 is the last category. And we'll talk more about this on the coming slides, but on this example here, this is a really interesting project that comes out of the IRC. It's called the Center for Economic Opportunity. It has been an office within IRC, US based, of course, and doing some really interesting work, collecting very good data, some of which we use in our work. You can see an example of that with a little image of the car there. We love that statistic. But really the idea here is to bring together sort of these, as it says, robust impact evaluation practices to really bring forward stories and the voices of the people that are being impacted here. This is where the RIN really feels like it has a role to play. Again, I'm not sure if we stated this earlier, but I think many of you know, the RIN is not a licensed broker. We are a investment intermediary instead. And so we really vet on the level of impact that is cited as a goal of these sorts of investments. And here you can see, well, some of the statistics here. This fund here is a $5 million fundraise, looking for a 0 to 2% yield. The CEO, the Center for Economic Opportunity, is a CDFI and a subsidiary of IRC. One of the things that really excited us about this engagement that we have is the opportunity to scale. Here we mention the 14 offices, and I think it's the intent of the project to scale out over all of these, and we feel this $5 million will take it along the way to doing that. In practice, what we see with these loans, they're small, anything from $100, $200 credit building sorts of loans to larger, $5,000 to $8,000, $10,000 car loans, to even small enterprise loans as well. And each one of these projects is established, and they're looking to scale it through this project here. Again, as we get into a few more slides, and we only have a few more to present here, we'll talk more about sort of the larger R6 engagements that RIN is undertaking right now. We go to the next slide, please. This here is the platform where you'll find each one of these investments listed. This is a work in progress. I think it always will be. It's something that is designed to be interactive on our website under investments. And if you click on one of these links, which we're unable to do in this presentation, but you can do if you go to our website and look, you'll see a profile of each one of these companies we've discussed today and many more. And this is our effort to help mobilize capital, to bring interested capital into contact with investment opportunities. And more than that, I would just add that we're partnering with Village Capital to use their viral software, which is a really nice online program that entrepreneurs can get into and take a questionnaire, which is very well designed and designed over a number of years, quite effective, we've found. The reports from the entrepreneur partners of ours have attested to this, that it really helps an organization get a snapshot of whether or not they are investment ready. And if they're not, what areas need to be worked on to increase their investment readiness. So that's one of the bonuses that you don't see immediately as someone just coming on to take a look at these investments as an investor, but the entrepreneurs clearly are taking advantage of and benefiting from. Please, check in from time to time to see this platform grow. And I think the rest of this is very self-explanatory. The other thing I might add here is it's kind of nice. We built in various screens. If you're interested in particular SDG investing, types of investments, R1 through 6, you can see sort of in the small font up in sort of the middle column there. You can scroll down and search by these various methods here. Okay, why don't we go to the next slide?
So, as Tim said, this is an emerging field. The intentionality of this really is what's the critical new factor. And we've only formally been operating for about 18 months. We have learned a lot, and it's something that we're improving on. But there are very much barriers that are limiting, I would say, both the deployment of capital as well as the growth and success of these enterprises that are either seeking that capital or seeking to expand their operations in some way. I'll start actually with the sort of the fifth issue here, which will be familiar for those who are working in the humanitarian context, and that is just the fact that most countries and markets that are hosting forcibly displaced people in some kind of setting at scale have some policies in place that either limit or outright prohibit those people's participation in the formal economy. This, it is just a state of affairs that the global system has not caught up to the current migration status. And when we think about sort of crisis, this isn't the fact that, to us, it's not a crisis that there are many, many millions of people on the move. It is more a crisis, the fact that we have designed systems that limit their potential. Investment has the power to change that. We see this in other contexts where capital is put to work, where business is put to work, and it is conditional on certain policy environments improving. Oftentimes this happens in more extractionist industries and not necessarily for the betterment of humankind, but it's the same instrument, and that really is economic leverage. So if we mobilize capital and we invest it into communities, neighborhoods, markets, and we make that conditional on those resources going to benefit those local community members as well as the newer arrivals, those policies will improve. And this is already starting to happen for different reasons and in different contexts. But we're seeing a shift from the early Jordan Compact 4 or 5 years ago to the legislation in Ethiopia, to a shift in the winds in Mexico. Despite this sort of outward focus on enforcement, there is a sort of a policy review on the table now. Sourcing, we are spending a lot of time as an intermediary right now working on larger deals because there's a lot of push from the capital community to see larger deals, but we also need to invest in the smaller ones and the earlier stage opportunities. If we don't do that, there will not be a pipeline for people to invest in later on. And it's a bit of a sort of, it's both chicken and egg and sort of resource constraint. But we have to think about filling in the gaps. Capacity building. This is about improving the capacity for, an understanding of investors, but as well as the investees. Deals are not happening because they're either not ready, they're missing something. The capital that is looking at them isn't the right kind of capital. They're looking at either, expecting higher returns or larger investments. And we have to make sure ventures are moving up that ladder and have access to the resources they need that are appropriate for who they are and what they are. So let me move on to the next slide. We can get back to this later. The RIN was created to meet these critical barriers head on. We have to also sequence our work. We can't do everything all at once. So I think we have our own frustrations about how much we can get done. But this is why we're here. We're here to help build this market, to facilitate deal flow, to support displaced communities and the people that are supporting them as best as we can. And as Tim said, to usher in a new paradigm around refugee response. So let's go to the next slide, as I want to get to our Q&A.
Yeah, I think that's right. Very good. And this is the last slide that we'll present, and we'll just do a very high level. These are the 4 pillars that really animate, really drive, when we wake up in the morning, come into work, what are we doing under each one of these areas here? This is our theory of change, really. We feel like if we're successful in each of these areas here, we will help to drive the capital and to create the good jobs that we're seeking to create amongst the displacement community. So just real quickly, John, let me just talk about mobilizing investment and going back sort of that R6 area, and you alluded to this. We're finding increasingly funds coming to the RIN and saying, we have a demand. There's a demand on the demands amongst our investors of how we can come up with a vehicle to touch this displacement crisis. And so we are working with 3 different fund managers right now, and at various areas of development with those various investors to build out displacement and refugee funds. It's very exciting, and maybe we can leave the rest of that to anyone who might have questions. John, do you want to cover the next 2 categories, just high level here?
Well, I mean, we need other actors in the space, and we also, want people to think that this isn't. Sometimes this is about creating things that are new. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's about using what you're already doing and just adding in a particular focus and intentionality. So, I know we have a number of participants on the call from microfinance, as well as the SME side. You're already doing this work in many markets that are already hosting displaced people. So part of this is about thinking about how do you use the practice that you're already undertaking and applying it to a community that has been underserved historically. There is viability here, and if you're interested in doing this, we can help you find your way in. The narrative changes by proof, by evidence. This is about helping to put a spotlight on the people that are building economic and social value everywhere, but who historically have been doing that in the informal market, or who haven't been given the microphone or the voice that they so deserve. So the more capital we can move, the more deals that we can support, the more entrepreneurs that we can empower, that will provide the content and the context for narrative change. So why don't we can talk all about the RIN, but this is really to get into the Q&As, and I'd love to answer some of the questions that you all have already asked and get into discussion, if that's okay.
Why don't you read that first question that I think you have there, John, and I think you can respond to that quickly. And I'll just say under the policy change, because a couple of people have asked, I alluded to earlier, the Refugee Opportunity Index. This is a project which some of you are aware of. We announced at our launch. It's a project with the Economist Intelligence Unit. We've received seed support from USA for UNHCR and the Inter-American Development Bank to build out an index that will incentivize governments through a ranking system to improve policies that are identified as lacking or wanting. And it will be a traditional sort of index based on 60 or 70 indices which we think is a way that we can help to move the needle on policy reform. Okay, I just wanted to get that quick one in there because I know there's some interest in that, John. And I don't know if you want to.
And you know, I think it's also important to thank the incredible funders that have, one, taken a chance on us as a new initiative, as a new organization, and two, to take a chance on doing things that don't exist out there, like ROI. So I know that USA for UNHCR is participating in this call, and I just want to thank them for their early support. Now, Jim Height, you had a very good question. You said that our definition of refugee can be confusing from a US perspective, since refugee is a legally defined status that includes formal vetting and financial assistance. How will you clarify that you're working with a much larger cohort? It's a good question. And you know, in the context of impact investing, terms and definitions have often gotten in the way of progress. And I hope that what we're trying to do here will address that in a new lens of impact investing. So if you're trying to build a market, you can't have it be so, you know, too thin and too small. We have to encourage people to participate and get into the game. And that might mean whatever is the nearest form of participation that is right for them. We also want to be intentionally inclusive and go beyond the UN and legal context, because sometimes it is these specific definitions that have actually limited support services going to people. For example, internally displaced people who far outweigh in terms of numbers the amount of formal or legally defined refugees out there, but often are facing exactly the same challenges. They just haven't crossed an international border. You know, so this is really about intentional design. One, we talk about this definition anytime we are engaging with a new partner. This is on our website. We put this in our materials. And so it's about sort of reinforcing this and trying to make a definition of displacement something that is both inclusive and normative. We are not operating in the specific legal context where those rights, responsibilities, and needs are, you know, under the same sort of purview or requirements of the UN. We're really oriented around both the capital community and then the entrepreneurial, deal, and displaced community. And we want everyone to see that there's a seat at the table for them and a chance to participate in this work. I hope that clarifies it. I'm happy to continue to discuss that one. But it's a good question.
And with all these questions, now we're going to be a little bit rushed to get through because we have quite a few really good questions like this next one here. We can follow up after this session as well. This one's from Kyoka Lyons. Hi, Kyoka, thanks for asking this question, this good suggestion, which is, does RIN have a forum or platform through which investors focused on refugee investments can connect with each other or even connect to other actors in this space, such as accelerators? What we've been doing is we've really been doing a fair bit of this informally. We do have our newsletter, which we're always trying to improve and connect people that way as well. And we invite everybody who's on this call to, when we throw out a call for news items in our newsletter, to share those with us. But it really isn't sufficient. And I really like the idea of creating a more formal sort of platform or forum for folks to get together. That's indeed what we're intended to do. We haven't built that out completely yet, but it's definitely on our list. The next question that is here, it has to do with the ROI. This is from Jane Pack. It says, you mentioned your current development of the ROI. Can you please share more? Also, how are you measuring impact beyond financial returns and in a way that consider long-term societal benefit? On the ROI, I think I answered this in part already. The next step that we have, we're holding an experts panel meeting at the beginning of December, in which we will enumerate each one of the indices that I've referred to earlier. I think we have a really good list of individuals to come together that represent everyone from investors to the private sector more broadly, to academics, to people who have had the experience, been displaced themselves, and are trying to get those key questions. As far as our impact measurement, that is another project that we have underway that we're working on right now, and is something that is really important. John, do you want to read Sarah's question?
Sure. Sarah Murray was working from an INGO that's identifying high potential markets and value chains for refugee employment and benefit. And it's great to hear, Sarah, that you're partnering with a number of off-grid energy companies in Uganda, expanding access to energy and jobs within refugee and host communities. So Sarah asks, how might we be able to tap into this fund to accelerate this type of partnership and effort, and what steps would you suggest to get started? So one, just a point of clarification is that the RIN is not a fund. We don't do direct investments ourselves. For us to really build this field out, we need to see 100 or maybe 1,000 different kinds of funds operating around the world. So that's where we work with other funds, we work with asset managers. But you certainly could partner with them. And one of the other things that we've seen is that investors and fund managers who operate in specific markets, whether they are focused on sectors like renewable energy or are regionally focused, let's say sub-Saharan Africa, and they focus on private equity, refugee and migration lens investing offers something new, something different, which they can actually take to market, or you could take to market with them. So over the last few years, we've actually seen a decline in Africa-focused investors, at least from the global North capital community. There's been a bit of a dip in private equity in Africa. And one of our partners was raising their third fund, and despite the success of their first two funds, was trying to think about how to attract new investors to participate in their work in sub-Saharan Africa. And part of it was actually leaning into this idea of supporting, through intention, these specific communities. Some of the companies that they'd invested in were already employing refugees and IDPs, but it was by accident rather than by design. Now they're considering, how do they make this an intentional practice? How can they achieve certain ratios of employees who are coming from a displaced background versus locals, and how do they actually improve the outcomes at the household level? And then that funnels back up to the investment community that they're targeting, and becomes something that they can sell from a social value perspective. If you're interested in looking at energy investment opportunities with a refugee migration lens, we'd be happy to talk to you about that, because there definitely are investors looking at that, and there might be some funders who would be willing to help explore that together.
We have, I think, 3 questions remaining here and comments, and might I recommend with Jesse Simmons and Ben Spevak and Sophia Voss and Jane Pack that we follow up offline here to be respectful of people's times, but we will get back to you. But I do want to say that thank you for joining today. We're on a journey. We're just getting started. We need your help. We appreciate all the help that you've already given, but we really want to build this network. So please help us be evangelists of the RIN, help us to evangelize on behalf of displaced people, that they are very capable and in need of the work that we're all setting out to do. So thank you for joining us today, and have a great end of your day.
Thank you, everybody.